The Media Project. Join the innovation revolution at the Black River Innovation Campus in Springfield, Vermont. Our soon-to-be renovated spaces are perfect for tech startups and creative enterprises eager to collaborate and thrive within the BRIC community. The question is, when are you making your move? Don't wait. Email us today at innovate@bricvt.org and start your journey. Again, that's innovate@bricvt.org.
Well, joining me this evening is our good friend Dominic Endicott. You may remember, if you're a longstanding listener to the Are We Here Yet podcast, that we had Dominic on in December of 2023. He is, along with the Ohio State University professor Dave Staley, the author of Knowledge Towns. And tonight, we're here to talk about a paper that we co-published recently, both Dominic and I, on the Pioneer Valley of Massachusetts. It's a Pioneer Valley Knowledge Town strategy proposal that we put out in November of 2024. Dominic, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
If I may, I'd really like to concentrate on two main areas. There are, as part of the mechanics of the paper, there are 6 areas of focus that we talk about, right? But there's 2 that really dominate in my opinion. And really, if those 2 don't happen, much of the rest does not. And so tonight I'd like to focus on these 2 big numbers. Okay. First of all, this is great. You know, the paper leads off with the quote, powering the new American dream, a $100 billion wealth creation strategy for the Pioneer Valley. Okay. So for a region like Western Mass, this is a relatively large number. For most rural regions of anywhere in the United States, a big number. We're going to concentrate, if I may, on housing, our number of 50,000 units of housing and what possibilities are unlocked, and sort of how we get there step by step. And then also a significant investment in venture capital.
Excellent. So just starting with that 100 billion number, because that sounds very scary. But when you think about the U.S. economy is about 150 trillion. So 100 billion relative to 150 trillion is actually a relatively small number. It's quite likely that in the next 10 years, wealth in the U.S. could double again to 300 trillion. And so we also have to be thinking, where's the whole economy going? And how do we move with that economy? And there are many parts of the country that are thinking about much bigger numbers, right? Like the city of Austin, Texas, by my calculations, has added about 700 billion in wealth in the last decade and is planning to add about another trillion in wealth. That's just one metropolitan area, right? So I guess that would be the first point. And I think then in sort of picking up on the housing side, that's an interesting number. It gets people's attention. The state of Massachusetts has declared that it needs about 200,000 homes. My calculations are that it needs more like 500,000 homes. And so depending on the number, this could be, 20 or 30% of that total, or it could be 10%. One of the reasons why I think the state's assumption of 200,000 is low is that Massachusetts is the number 1 most attractive state in the country. And despite that, it's losing about 40, 50,000 people every year. The reason it's losing those people is really about housing more than anything else. There's many things, but housing is probably ultimately the thing that's causing a lot of people to leave. And so if you solve the housing problem and you build 20, 30,000 homes and you do a good job in the Pioneer Valley, what's going to happen is that it's going to generate more demand. More people want to move into the Pioneer Valley, and therefore you'll actually need a bigger number. That's why it's good to be thinking at that magnitude.
I would agree. I would agree with you. And additionally, and specific to the paper, you gave some great comparisons, right? So at first blush, the idea of $1 billion fund in the Valley sounds unfeasible, or, the kind of money it would take for 50,000 years of housing. However, here's just some numbers, right? The combined endowments of Pioneer Valley higher ed institutions is something like $8 billion, right? The combined land assets are in the range of 5,000 acres. Now, if you look at the average price per acre of developable land in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that probably takes up another 15%, getting your way to $100 billion in value, right? That's sitting there, and that's mostly thinking about the Pioneer Valley and stuff, and not the total of the western third of the state. Future earning potential of the collective and enrolled students, which I think there's some 45,000 students in the Western Mass area, that could add up another $8 billion in additional wealth. So there are a variety of different ways to measure overall wealth in the region, and the $100 billion doesn't seem so scary anymore once you look at that. And then when you think about the rate at which housing increases in value in Massachusetts year upon year. Now, granted, if we really make a dent in the inventory problem, that starts to slow down a bit, but not so much that you're not going to see a halfway decent return on investment in homes. When you consider all of the other positive factors, and including the financial ones that go into more people, more homes, a more stable neighborhood and more stable society.
Yeah. I think the fundamental issue with the Pioneer Valley is that really where most of the homes in Massachusetts want to go in some sense is in Eastern Massachusetts, because that's where there's a lot of the job pressure and the housing crisis in terms of very high cost of housing is worse. And so the challenge for a region like the Pioneer Valley is that if it builds a lot of houses and it attracts people, it's probably not going to attract enough jobs unless you also do the venture capital, right? So
agreed, yeah.
And that's different than in Eastern Massachusetts, where you say fundamentally Eastern Massachusetts just has to build a lot of houses. And that's going to be hard to do for all sorts of reasons. I think in the Pioneer Valley, it has to do three things. It has to build a lot of houses, but it also has to create lots of jobs, and it has to create them fast. And that's where venture capital comes in, because really venture capital has been proven in the last 40 years as the only effective way of creating productive and sustainable jobs that keep growing. You can fund companies to move to a place, but as soon as the tax deal that has been met with that company goes away and the obligations have gone away, that's not really an interesting place. Those companies will move away.
It's very fundamental. Like, you don't want to pay to have friends.
Exactly, right? So venture capital is different in the sense that if a place is fundamentally attractive, and certainly if it invests in housing, but in particular, not just housing, but placemaking, right? If it makes itself and its towns and cities really attractive, and then you create a pool of venture capital and you get some high growth startups and they stick in the area, and they could be spin outs from UMass or, some of the other great colleges in the Valley. The challenge is if you drip feed it with a little bit of venture capital or a little startup program, and so many universities have a $5 million, $10 million thingy, and they sort of have these cool little programs, and that's enough to get maybe some students to start a company, but it's not enough to get it to stick. You need a lot of money. You need as much money as you can raise, and at that point, what starts to happen is these companies are starting to get real. They go from 3 or 4 people to 20 to 40 to 50 to 100. They attract more venture capital from outside the region, and at some level, one of them becomes a unicorn, and then once you have a unicorn, that region gets found, is suddenly in the club, And other people say, well, wow, you can start a real company, you can make it valuable. Now I can start a company. The people that have exited from that unicorn and made some money, what they tend to want to do is go and invest in real estate and in new startups, right? So that phenomenon starts to replicate. And you might say, well, that seems very pie in the sky. But actually, you can look nearby to the city of Burlington, Vermont. And, 4 or 5 years ago, it had a nice little startup scene, but it was not anything close to what it is today. We've got 3 multi-billion-dollar companies that have emerged, in a short period of time. Probably the best valued is Beta Technologies, which is worth over $3 billion. And that's come because there was a critical mass of venture capital. It was adjacent to a great university like UVM and Champlain College. And so there was kind of an ecosystem. And there was that venture capital. They came together. It was a nice place to live. And magic has happened. And there's no reason why that could not happen in the Pioneer Valley. An interesting data point is that in 2010, there were only 7 cities in America that could host a unicorn. They had what I'd call a mature tech ecosystem. By 2022, that was 42. I'd say today it's probably 70 or 80. And I think it's going to get to like 150 or 200 locations in the US, right? So in a sense, I'd say right now is a jump ball. Some places are really going for it. Frankly, most of them outside of New England, a lot in the South, in the west of the country. So places that haven't seen venture capital are really hungry for it. Paradoxically, in New England, where really venture capital was born and, out of Boston, we're kind of standoffish about it. We should be embracing it. Another great example is the city of Oxford in England, a nice, sleepy university town. They wanted not to be sleepy anymore. They raised first a $500 million fund. Then they raised more money. That's attracted about 3 or 4 billion of follow-on capital. Now it's really become the second largest venture market in the UK. They've even taken over from their rival across the country of Cambridge. And so Manchester is doing the same thing. So you are seeing these things happening, and they could happen in the Pioneer Valley as well.
And we have not to create an air of competition around this, but there are secondary markets here in the Northeast that are at least trying, right?
Yes.
A few that come to mind: Portland, Maine. We know that in the Upper Valley, the sort of boundary, the Connecticut River Valley between Vermont and New Hampshire, in the Dartmouth-Hanover area, we have we're starting to see signs, again, much smaller scale of money, but there's beginning to be much more of an interest in both venture capital and, as an example, I think it's the city of Hanover, right, wants to put $150 million into housing, or maybe it's actually the Dartmouth College itself that wants to invest directly into somehow into the housing market,
Yeah.
which is, for that area, that's not an insubstantial amount of money to be putting towards housing. So we're starting to see places that are saying, hey, wait, if we have these 2 main tranches of investment, and if we can create some real scale around them, and do it simultaneously, we can really invigorate our local economy. So that's not to say that if they do it first, the Pioneer Valley can't do it, but to simply say that in such a small area as we have, and with the importance of a point I want to make is it's important that, particularly in venture capital, that a lot of local investment gets it started, because when there's wins, if all the money came from afar, of course, then it's truly an extractive process, right? There's no investment wins that come back to the local area, and so it's important that some of those wins happen and actually reinvigorate the local market, right? Which is why it's important to mix money from afar with your local investors, which you need those pioneers, right?
Right. You need the local element, and you need the out of state and the out of town element, because there's a lot of skills as well. And also, if you're looking to raise more capital, both on the venture side and on the housing side, on the placemaking side, as you gain success, that will expand the range of investors who will get interested in this place as a place of investment. You've also seen that from the real estate side, that it used to be that in the New England area, most investors really wanted to be in Boston. But now you're seeing increasingly that they're moving out of Boston and they're looking at lots of other locations. And as a place starts to get known as, I can invest, I can get a return, this place has got its act together. Typically it requires a good town and gown collaboration. Is the town working with the gown in an effective way? Is the university spinning out interesting companies? Are they supportive of tech transfer? Are entrepreneurs happy to be there? The thing that Massachusetts has going for it is it has, one of the most amazing concentrations of talent in the world. It has access to, $10 trillion in Boston, as well as 40 trillion in New York. So it's sitting next to some of the deepest capital markets in the world. You could think about the sort of Boston to Washington area as really the wealthiest nucleus of kind of GDP and kind of productivity and wealth in the world. And we're sitting within that, at one end of it. And we're at a time where every industry is being transformed. And so, for example, we are going to go through an energy transition. We're going to go through a data center, massive growth in data centers. We're going to go into robotics. We need to completely remake our manufacturing base. So there's all these industries that are just getting going. Pioneer Valley has great heritage, great universities, lots of the pieces. In a sense, sometimes we don't even realize how much we have. The challenge is really a coordination challenge and a sequencing. And I think sometimes this also becomes very overwhelming because the numbers are really big, but you can also sort of bring it down to what's the first set of moves, right? And so the first set of moves may be, let's create a kind of cool, innovation cluster, a knowledge neighborhood, a tech village, whatever you want to call it, that's combining placemaking, a little bit of co-working space, innovation. Maybe it's close to one of the universities or colleges. It's got a certain vibe. It's got coffee houses. We all kind of know what those places look and feel like, right? So create one and fund one. And that's maybe attracting, a quantum of capital that's manageable and prove it out, right? And then as that starts to happen, other places in the valley will be thinking, hey, I could do that too. And so you'll start to sort of get this sort of entrepreneurial feel of kind of a copycat mechanism, which is really good. And if this sounds crazy, if you actually look at the sort of industrial revolution and how it spread across the U.S. In the 19th century, it was like that, right? It started in the big cities, in Boston and New York and cities like that. Many other places didn't even exist, or there were tiny little villages. And then it just started spreading from place to place, and entrepreneurs started copying each other. So really, it's the key thing is to have this big aspiration as a region to say we can actually build something really big. And then to start, not small, but start with something that's manageable, that you can kind of execute in 25, 26, 27, sort of in the near term, get going, and then have some faith that it will start to create this knock-on effect.
One thing that to add to that I think the Valley has advantage over a lot of other secondary markets close by, or even, in other parts of the country, we have things like an existing sort of footprint of density, which is de-intensified, over the 20th century. However, the footprint is still there. I'm talking about a lot of mill cities, like Holyoke, like Springfield, still, even to this day, with really good nodes of rail, as an example, that are live, really good warehousing, really good manufacturing space that still exists, not all of it, outmoded, and a lot of machining, as an example, taking place. So in other words, a lot of a good footprint, so that not only are we talking about 50,000 units of housing as an example, to be had, but the capacity to actually produce that housing in quantity faster and with innovation, right? Combining innovation, potentially even combining venture capital investment in scaling up things like custom modular construction, innovative materials, right, that could be mass produced in the area. It's not unheard of, in other words, that this could happen relatively rapidly in a place. And really, mostly what you're doing is reinvigorating both the industrial nature and the density of what's already there. In other words, we're not taking away natural resources more than we already did in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and leaving ourselves, bereft of natural resources that we need to live. We're not exhausting more land, right? Because the areas, some of the few, arable land left in the state, density intensifies as you head east. So we don't really even have to build new footprint. We're certainly not advocating building new suburbia. And you can see these ways that, like, both smart venture capital investment, where they're feeding off of each other, where that's actually driving and creating more of a rapid capacity for the housing, at the same time that it's the housing, in fact, that we need to attract more people to live and work in this place, right? If I can't find a place to live, then what's the point of getting a job here, right?
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Well, I think you're totally on it, right? And you could look at places like Sweden and Japan, where about 30 to 40% of the housing is manufactured and modular, and in fact is built with a lot of robotics. And you can think about, that's actually a way to get into robotics, right? The first thing that you're doing is you're building the components for assembly into housing, and that's critical because keeping the costs per square foot down as low as possible is going to be essential, because what we've seen is the cost of making a house has gone up a lot for all sorts of reasons, including some regulations that are not always as constructive as they were perhaps intended to be. So I think we have to look at those, but also we've lost a lot of skills. You're going to see a surge in demand for skilled people in the housing industry. For example, there's going to be a huge demand in LA with the reconstruction that's going on there, and therefore coming up with kind of a way to drive down the cost. And one of the great things is, if you're building a sufficient volume of housing and you can get some commitments over time, you can then sort of go down a scale curve and get more and more efficient. And that could be an opportunity for some of these mill towns to really reinvent themselves around a new wave of manufacturing that could begin with housing, but could move into robotics, a new industrial advanced manufacturing, and where there could be a very interesting relationship with universities like UMass Amherst. They're doing some amazing research, and that could be then sort of spinning out those technologies into sort of generating a new wave of industries. And again, this is a little bit of a playback of what already happened before. It's been done before. It was successful before. We now have this new wave of industrialization. So now is the perfect time.
Hello, I'm Peter Graves, and welcome to television stations of the 1980s that may or may not have existed, but probably didn't. But they might have. But I'm pretty sure they didn't. On tonight's program, it's the history of WLVIII, Channel 58. Channel 58 was located in Peru, Massachusetts, founded by car dealership owner and part-time porn enthusiast filmmaker Pat Figg. Channel 58 had come to be known for its quirky and offbeat programming that was borderline illegal. It probably would have gotten shut down if more people actually knew about it. It slipped under the FCC's radar because they thought it was just an abandoned meatpacking facility. Little did they know that it was a television station. Most people still don't know that it's a television station. For those who remember Channel 58, most have no idea what became of it. Some think it's still around. Others think they stopped broadcasting when a herd of cattle trampled the channel's transmitter. Some say it was just a crazy fever dream. Others state that WLVIII Channel 58 is part of a greater conspiracy, sort of a Mandela effect, much like Shazam starring Sinbad, The Monopoly Man's Monocle, The Berenstain Bears, or Madonna's Virginity. But one thing is for sure, it's a station that nobody remembers and will soon never forget. For the History Channel, I'm Peter Graves. Now, who wants to watch a documentary about gladiators?
You could also be thinking about rail. And so, there's this chicken and egg thing that, you'd love to have a high-speed rail connecting, say, Springfield to Boston in an hour. That should be a reality. But that's going to cost money. But one way to kind of, in a sense, fund it is if you build enough critical mass of new housing, that will, in essence, fund the rail. And you could even start to see models where you're tying property and rail. And if that sounds crazy, that's really the way the first rail revolution in this country happened. There's places like Japan, Hong Kong, Spain, many other places, Denmark, where the rail and the construction of the infrastructure is closely tied to property value, because there's an understanding that effectively one drives the other, right? So, but you're not going to get the interest of the state of Massachusetts if you have a plan to build 1,000 homes, because that's not going to move the needle. That's why having a big enough plan and obviously making it credible and serious is critical to sort of get the attention of the rest of the state and even at the federal level.
For raising this kind of venture capital, or on the other side, raising this kind of capital for housing real estate investment, do we need novel financial mechanisms? Do we need to be building new financial institutions that currently do not exist? And how hard would that be in one of the world's basically, capital centers, right? Being only an hour or two from Boston?
The answer is yes, we need to. And paradoxically, it may be hard at first because I think we have become very ossified and silo-based in our financial models. And what I mean by that is that you have a hyper specialization. So even in real estate, you have specialists in senior housing or student housing or office or retail. And we need to, in a sense, bring those categories together, because I think what we're talking about is actually combining all of those themes. You want to basically create a neighborhood in which you have a little bit of office space, some co-working, some housing for different ages. I wouldn't call anything senior housing. What I would be doing is blending all sorts of ages and stages into a community, which is also where you get a lot of magic, right? So if you think about, you may have a young household with children and two working parents, and they need childcare. And in the old model of the suburbs, somebody's going to have to drive 30 minutes to a childcare center, and a worker will have to drive there, and it becomes very complicated. If everything's sort of close by, you could see some older people that maybe want to be in this community and could have some hours dedicated to taking care of younger children. And that's a lot easier because they're within walking distance, right? So the placemaking and the integration of all of this becomes critical. Going back to the problem here is that our financial financing models are not designed for that kind of thing. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the traditional backup finance models that really underwrite most of the real estate and most of the mortgages are really designed around single family homes or these kind of conventional models like a 5/1, but not for this kind of mixed use model. So we will have to design new forms of financing and new structures and sort of create effectively these new templates. And that will be a challenge because they're not really something that we're used to doing, and they're going to feel a little bit strange. And you'll have to be running your Excel spreadsheets in a slightly different way, where you're not trying to maximize every square foot in terms of value. You're trying to actually design something holistic that works well overall, that drives longer term value. So here's an example. A kind of very kind of sharp penciled private equity, milk every dollar kind of approach might say, I want to bring a you know, national branded coffee house to my neighborhood. But we kind of know that actually a more local commerce type of thing that maybe makes less money is much more important to long-term community formation. And so we may want to subsidize that because we think it's going to generate value somewhere else. So we have to look at all these sort of cross economies. And these are things we're not comfortable with doing. And that's really where we need to move to.
I think additionally, so I totally see and understand, changing underwriting parameters, maybe even, creating new financial mechanisms or institutions, right, that previously did not exist, whose charters more closely match this more holistic approach to looking at how you build a physical place. And at the same time, I think rethinking the way we do local ordinances, certainly zoning, because at the core of most community zoning, these were exclusionary measures, right? In other words, they were meant to exclude, they were designed to exclude either certain groups of people or certain types of housing, certain classes of people. And so, we talk about the siloing off of industrial disciplines or the siloing off of financial mechanisms. Well, we've also siloed off, groups of people and types of housing and so forth. And so, coming back to that more, everything you've just described is more of that sort of Jane Jacobs, the organic neighborhood of, 5,000 years of civilization, right? Returning back to that because there's a strong social reason, a set of reasons why that's important. And then there's very practical, like, our elders and our young are better taken care of when we're all living literally together and not siloed off into, separate neighborhoods by age and so forth,
Yeah. And with this right balance between community as well as being able to retreat into your own private space. And so achieving a good balance of that. And that's always a bit of an art, but sort of places that are encouraging that. The other thing I should add is I think there's this idea that we need incrementalism and really to unlock a wave of developers. So it's not just like the big groups, because right now the other thing that's happening is that really the only groups that are able to finance a lot of the construction in Massachusetts is sort of the larger groups. And I think they play a critical role in the ecosystem. But you also want to unleash small developers, even a family that could convert a single family home into a duplex or a quadplex. And I think recently you've had the ADU laws being passed. So that's a move in the right direction, but it's kind of a small move. I think you look at Vermont and they've actually been bolder in terms of changing the zoning so that by right, you can turn any home into a quadplex that has sewer access. And that's a great idea, but they haven't quite figured out the financing mechanisms yet. I think Massachusetts should be doing the same thing, but absent the state doing that, doesn't stop a town from actually passing overlay zoning to allow by right anybody to do this kind of transformation. But also, even if they do that, there aren't the financing mechanisms. So we need to think about ways to encourage all sorts of people to get into small scale development. And that kind of incremental urbanism will be a very good complement to sort of the bigger developers who can move fast in some areas, but they won't be enough to bring this quantum of housing. And also there's a risk that it'll become too cookie cutter. It'll be too much of a same model. So the beauty is unleashing kind of an army of individuals with each of their own ideas. The interesting thing is people might worry that people are going to come up with very strange things, but actually a lot of the research that's been done around preferences suggests that between 70 to 90% of people's preferences are actually pretty similar. We all kind of like the same thing. There's a group of people like architects and so on that tend to like very extreme things, but most people like the same kind of stuff, right? So if you just unleash people, let them get on with it, you're going to end up with pretty nice housing, right? You don't have to control everything. I think it's one thing to say, we don't want a stinky, huge factory in the middle of a neighborhood, right? The way maybe that was done. And that was one of the reasons why zoning was brought in the first place, to sort of prevent the kind of slightly outrageous things. But it's another thing to say, we want to sort of constrain what people can do. The other thing is, you used to have lots of corner stores and sort of mom and pops, or maybe a store above a house, all these kind of interesting mixing of commerce into neighborhoods. That is beautiful. It's wonderful. It's been done for millennia. We should be allowing that kind of stuff to go back, right? So
Right, and that's
get out of the way.
We're calling that nowadays, good placemaking, right? But the simple fact of the matter is, what we now have to call, we only have this phenomenon of good placemaking because we did away with the natural proclivity to build neighborhoods this way. We actually have to call it something now. You know what I mean? To get this kind of scale too, what you're saying, it's this no holds barred, all hands on deck kind of approach, right? Where we want to incentivize existing homeowners. We want to help renters make transition into home ownership, and maybe even, additional units for others to live in. Large developers help emerging developers get off the launching pad. The same goes, I feel like, for venture capital. It has an equivalency in venture capital in that, for one, a future healthier environment in the region would have more sort of like boutique VC funds, with emerging those that have gone from being an emerging fund into very mature leaders, right, within the region, and maybe even become national and international competitors. But there has to be this steady flow of people going up.
Investment flowing in. So, all these ecosystems begin with people that write small checks to help somebody get going, right? So creating that full ecosystem. The other one I wanted to sort of really think about and mention is, how do you get people getting into the equity game? So we talk about equity in lots of different ways. The way I think about equity is equity formation, right? So how can you get somebody that maybe has some school loans, they don't have a down payment for a home, but actually turning everybody into owning a little bit of equity, I think, is transformative. And there are mechanisms where even a large development could, for example, give a bonus in equity the longer you live there, right? So if you live in a place for 4 or 5 years, maybe what you do is you get like 1% of the value per year as a kind of bonus for living there. Why is that in the interest of the developer? Because now you have everybody thinking like an owner.
Right.
Even if they have a 1%, now they don't think like a renter so much. They start to think like an owner. Now they're looking out for you, and they want to make the value of the equity go up. There's some really interesting models where you can even have, traditionally the financing when you buy a home, the individual does the equity and then the bank takes the mortgage risk. What about having a financial intermediary that's also an equity investor and is participating in the value growth of the home, right? So there's many of these mechanisms that have kind of been prevented by a financing system. And this is why sometimes what you need is almost a macro level development corporation that's kind of sitting above this, is working with big finance, is helping finance some of the large projects, but is also trying to encourage this sort of democratic development process that is really bringing everybody in, right? So it's not just going to a small few. This should be something that every part of the community has a stake in and feels like they're part of.
Yeah, and this gets to my earlier question about, is it in fact new financial institutions, right, that might need to emerge in order to properly finance these things? Another example of that, where I think they could offer a solution, is in the stasis between those sort of stuck, for lack of a better term, in single family homes that have a preference for some other type of living situation, namely either to come downtown in a more walkable, bikeable environment, also have a lot of restaurants around and not have to drive everywhere, right? So we're talking overwhelmingly, those are older folks. And then you have people that maybe given an easing of mortgages, overall pricing on house, a number of financial factors, would want to transition from renting into home ownership. Your idea of offering equity over time is a great example of like, yeah, why don't we do that, right? You know, we know structurally why that can't happen today, but wouldn't it be great if those people could rise up to the occasion and get those single family homes when they need that kind of housing, and get the people sort of stuck in those houses now out and into housing that is more befitting of their current lifestyle, and end this sort of stasis, right? That's all part of the stasis of greater stasis in the housing ecosystem, which besides inventory shortage is the whole reason why middle market housing is in a real conundrum right now.
Yeah, and you see these kind of sort of situations where people would like to sell out of their single family home, but the options are often to move into a 55 plus community. And that's the only option. And, that ends up being, a lot older when you move there, and it ages, and everybody's aging in place. And so over time, it really becomes a place that just keeps getting older and older. So instead of that, if you could move into more of a mixed age community where you're with young families and children, and you see that synergy, but you have to sort of build those situations. And I think many people that would like to age in place within the town where they spent all their lives, the reality is that when they look around, they can't really financially downsize because the cute condo that kind of fits the bill is maybe as expensive as the single family home. So it just doesn't make any sense. So you have to sort of build a lot more abundance in that kind of model of probably it's going to be more of a multi-family model rather than a single family. But there's many, many ways of doing it. Also playing with sizes so that you've got more flexibility. So some people that maybe are just coming up, they may need almost a co-housing model, which is a relatively small footprint kind of bedroom with a small kitchenette, a lot of communal stuff, but that's kind of what they can afford, but it gets them in the game. And maybe some people that have a change in their life and now they want to move to something smaller as well because they want to go to Florida half the year. So the more flexibility we can kind of provide to people and the more formats, the more I think everybody's going to flourish.
Well, all great considerations to think about, and we've exemplified, I dare say, what we start the summary in the paper as saying the opening statement is this paper does not aim to reach a conclusion, but to start a conversation, which is exactly what it has done for you and I this evening, okay? And good things for people to think of. We hope that a lot of our listeners in Massachusetts listen up and listen carefully, and those of us looking to make smart investments in Western Mass, this is possible.
Absolutely.
Dominic Endicott, Knowledge Towns fame. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
SMG's Are We Here Yet podcast is a production of M the Media Project and SM Graves Associates. Learn more at smgravesassociates.com. To download your copy of Pioneer Valley's Knowledge Town Strategy Proposal, go to smgravesassociates.com/whitepages.